Tim Stellmach, Laura Baldwin, and Sara Verrilli.
I'm Tim Stellmach. I was employee number 6 or 9 or something at Looking Glass, so I was there quite early. This would be starting on Ultima Underworld 1, actually, when I was in playtest. I started in the design role as lead designer on Underworld 2.
What years were these, just to get a little context?
Must have been 91 or 92 on Underworld 1. Yeah, it would be 1991. And I guess for Underworld 2, which was sort of the first time that I really had authorial input, really. There's an extent to which you have that in playtest, but it's pretty limited. So that would be 92, 93, long time ago now. And then I was also one of the designers on Terra Nova and System Shock. I was lead designer on Thief and Thief 2.
So the games in order would be, just for clarity's sake.
Underworld 1, Underworld 2, Terra Nova, System Shock, Terra Nova. Right. Like, it was a long time ago. And then Thief and Thief 2.
Okay, and then just also for the sake of clarity, like if you had to just say like what your role was in each one of those two, it was like the actual title role was, so it was like tester in Underworld 1?
Tester in Underworld 1 and lead designer on Underworld 2. Okay. On System Shock I don't know if we had a lead designer on System Shock. It was more just a cabal, as Valve would have put it. And on Terra Nova, I was a designer and programmer. I did some of the tools and user interface and stuff in those days. And Thief, both games, I was lead designer on those.
Okay. Is that it for your intro? And
that's all I can think
anything
of.
else you want to say? Okay.
Yeah.
You go to Laura.
I'm Laura Baldwin. I came into Looking Glass pretty late. I've been trying to count on my fingers here, and probably about 97. I worked on Thief and System Shock 2, and then Thief 2. I was sort of a backfield designer. I was only half-time, so I wasn't in charge of any levels. But a lot of the stuff that I did was sort of dialogue. Come up with 10 different ways for a guard to say, I think maybe I've heard something. And then 10 more ways for them to have maybe seen something, or all right, now when they've definitely seen something. So that was a lot of writing into spreadsheets. I did conversations. I did a lot of sort of random things like editing motion captures. I guess I have 3 authorial things I'm proud of. I did the Bear Pits conversation at the beginning of Thief.
Oh, man.
I came up with the word taffer, and I did the doggerel that the trickster says at the end of Thief, because there was this big ritual, but he wasn't saying anything, and it was like, he has to have it. It's a ritual. He has to say something. And then probably my favorite thing was when that got translated, and the audio recordings came back with the people in French, and people in German saying these poems that I had written that had been translated into French and German and still rhymed, being said by people, and that was really cool.
Yeah, because rhyming, I know, was a big part of the whole trickster aspect of the story and everything, so that was very cool. And the Bear Pits conversation is literally the first thing you hear in the game, right? I mean, like, you start the game and
there's some
during gameplay,
during gameplay.
There's a briefing and stuff before.
But I mean, like,
if
you just start the level, like, that's the first thing you hear, even in the demo.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think everybody remembers that.
And it's actually one of the longer conversations. Pretty much everything else got cut to 4 lines because otherwise it just took up too much time. But the Bear Pits got to stay longer so that people could go and listen to it. I guess. So.
Cool. Is that it for you?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay. I joined Looking Glass just a little bit before Laura. I did playtest on System Shock 1, and then I was a lead playtester on many of their other games, either sole or joint. Flight Unlimited, Terra Nova, and then on Thief, as a matter of fact, I started out as the lead playtester. And then
You tried to quit, and we had to stop you.
yeah, and then I tried to quit Looking Glass because I was kind of tired of being a lead tester. Or at that point, I think I was actually the quality assurance supervisor was the actual title, which meant I was getting further and further from playing games and more from telling people to play games. And that got me shifted into a designer position on Thief. And then I was the lead designer on the Thief Gold project, and the lead designer on the Thief Gold 2 project, which promptly got canceled on us, which is about the time Looking Glass went out of business.
Speaking of which, I recently saw the on your website, Tim, the videos.
From the final day
From the final
videos
day
that
of
Mike
Looking Glass,
Krasowski did.
which apparently had been you put up only recently, or you posted recently.
Yes, well, Mike Krasowski did the videos, and he had them at one time. I don't know if it was on his personal website or what, but only recently he got them converted over and got them all up on YouTube around the time of the 10th anniversary of Looking Glass closing down. And that was, I think, the first time when they really got spread widely.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot more feedback to them when he did that. So,
yeah, it was interesting that you mentioned it because I looked at a few of them and I know that there is, and in fact, you mentioned being forgetful before, like hoping you can remember stuff that happened 15 years ago. But I think you even said that because there's something with Marc LeBlanc in the videos talking about
the severed heads.
The severed head, the puzzle in System Shock 1. Where you
I always loved that puzzle, and I found out by watching the videos that I helped come up with it.
Yeah, because he has a story about you're driving, you're somewhere, on the road, and you have this idea because it's like really late or really early.
Yeah, we were coming home from the office. I think it didn't count as late at night anymore, according to his. And again, this is like Mark remembers this, and I do not. And it may be that I don't remember it because we had been up all night and nothing was really going on in my brain at the time, except apparently helping come up with this severed head puzzle. The severed head puzzle being that we had these severed heads laying around on Citadel Station in System Shock to show all the violence that had happened pre-game when Shodan had taken over the station. And somehow we came up with the idea that these heads had to be a puzzle somehow. And in fact, I think we already by that time had art associated with each one, inventory art. So if you picked one up and put it in your inventory, you would get a shot of one of the developers, basically, in severed head form. And we just loved that so much that we just had to call attention to it, I guess, was the point. And our means of doing that was, of course, a retina scanner that locked down a door that you wanted to get through. So we had to actually find the person who was authorized to go through that door and bring their head to the retina scanner.
You had to find the right severed head.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of severed heads.
Quite a few, yeah. So there was a specific one you had to find. I think the idea was that there was a log. The audio logs had portraits of the speaker as well. And so you had to match up the portrait in the audio log with the inventory image of the severed head to figure out who was the right person to...
And if I recall correctly, the audio log also gave some hint as to where that particular person had been. So
yes, it was the log that would let you know that person was authorized.
Yeah, and it also said where
image in that log.
And he was working in this location.
Right.
So then that would tell you sort of where to go to look through the severed head, so you didn't have to look through every single head in the station.
Yes. And I totally don't remember having had any part coming up with that.
Well, I feel like this is a really good segue to one of the things I wanted to hear more about, which is the whole because that's a really memorable moment from that game, or a really memorable puzzle, or a really memorable aspect that's really well integrated into the fictional universe of the game and everything. It's not like one of those Resident Evil puzzles where it's like, oh, here's a statue that sort of is just here, right? Now you have to flip some switches on it, and why did anybody build this? Because obviously nobody would be able to get around the mansion if this was really here. So one of the things I remember about playing that game at the time is it was so... like the game design, the world design, and everything was so fictionally meshed together.
Yes. And that has to do with the process that occurred to develop it. It wasn't a puzzle that had been thought out ahead of time, and the elements in the game meant to fit it. And there's a whole lot to be said about this entire topic when it comes to Thief, because Thief 1 and Thief 2 were very different in that specific regard. But it was an element that came out of work that we had been doing on the game, and so naturally it was very closely integrated into what was going on in the game world, because it emerged from that through the process of iteration as we went through the game, elements that were present there that inspired us to include this puzzle.
So from a development process point of view, was it like the game world was designed first, then largely? I mean, what were the original ideas? Was it just like, hey, we want to have a space station, we want to have a bunch of dead people in it, and we'll figure out the puzzles later?
That was literally the very first thing that I remember, and it was a reaction to the Underworld games that we were sort of constantly chafing against the limitations of conversation systems and their inability to be more than sort of thematically like conversations, right? Like a conversation, even in RPGs today, right? The most common model there is that you have some menu of utterances that you can say at any given time, and that will lead you through this sort of graph of possible paths in the conversation. And that's not really very much like having an actual conversation. It's really more a mini game that's themed on conversations. And I think probably Doug in particular was sick of that. I mean, Doug has always been very interested in this problem of how to model character in game. And so after 2 games of doing that sort of thing in Underworld, there was the idea in System Shock to just sort of apply some Aikido to the problem and, doctor, this hurts, well, don't do that. So the solution in System Shock, of course, as anyone who's played it knows, is there are no conversations because all the NPCs start off the game dead. And you get to know them, but you do so through these logs that they left behind and the disasters that happened all pre-game, which, continuing to this day, if you play the BioShock games, it's exactly the same kind of narrative model. And what was the question now?
Oh, the question was, it seems to me like what you're saying is like the kind of the puzzle design of the game emerged out more of a desire to design a believable, seamless world.
even not just puzzle design specifically, but like that whole sort of game system design, right? Like the decision to have audio logs as opposed to a conversation system, right? Came from this sort of narrative decision. Or vice versa, actually, right? The narrative decision to have this pregame disaster that wiped everyone out was based on this limitation of what we wanted to be able to attempt in the game.
This actually reminds me of something that Austin said last time, where he was saying that a part of this idea came from Underworld II, which you said you also worked on, where he said that there was one. For people who might not know, Underworld 2 has several different worlds in it, and one of them was a tomb where everybody was dead.
Right. And
he was actually saying, in some sense, System Shock was kind of almost like extending that idea. Maybe the kernel of that idea is kind of in.
I hadn't thought of that, but I don't have anything to say against it either. I mean, the thing about Underworld 2 in that regard is the need to make the worlds that you went through distinct from each other kind of led to a certain amount of stylistic experimentation, in order to draw those distinctions. So yeah, it's very natural then, I don't even know if I thought about that time, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if Austin did. I mean, he was the writer.
Yeah, well, he explained it in that way, which I thought was interesting. I hadn't thought about it.
No.
Right. Yeah. Well, speaking of dialogue and the problem of dialogue, I thought it might be interesting to hear some of Laura's ideas about this, because I know that your job was to write dialogue for this kind of, as almost like an extension. So Thief was kind of one of the following games is kind of revising some of these similar concepts, right? So like,
where everyone's alive, but you don't actually talk to any of them. You eavesdrop on them.
Yeah. So to me that always felt like an extension of trying to look for a solution. It's like so one solution was killing people and finding recordings. Like, okay, so how do we do it without having people dead? They're alive, they're talking to each other, but you can't talk to them. Was that conscious, or was that not some? Because
I think yes. But I don't want to.
I mean, I
didn't actually have to execute it.
I wasn't a designer. I was sort of a task carry-outer. But I do think that there, back in the early evolution of games, there were adventure games, sort of the first, you wander around and do things, and computer role-playing games, which are not really like role-playing games, sprang out of that. And in an adventure game, everything is very limited. There are 4 things in the room that you can interact with, and they can only interact with each other and you. And computer role-playing games, there's a lot more sort of freedom to wander around and poke at things, but the dialogue or the conversation systems, I think, is still very adventure-like. There are 4 things you can say to this person, and then they can only say those things back to you. When I was brought on, it was already a sneaker at that point. So I think there was never really going to be any conversations with Garrett talking to the NPCs. But it did. I mean, we wanted it to feel like a world where these were actual people. They had motion captures for standing around and sort of fidgeting to make them seem like people you were sneaking by and people who got bored and if they were going to be, emitting these utterances every so often saying, oh, I've noticed something, oh, I'm looking for something, oh, I've decided I'm not looking for something anymore, they kind of had to be talky, and then they had to be at least a little bit talky to each other so that the fact that they kept saying things.
Right, it makes them more authentic. I mean, and that is a really good observation. The needs of the gameplay in Thief mean that the NPCs have to be really chatterboxes about all of their innermost feelings and observations, right? Because that's how you can tell what their AI state is. And
it's a feedback system.
Yeah, the whole point of the game is to outsmart these AI on some level, and this is the information that you're using to do so. But if that was all they ever talked about, it would be really unnatural.
And also sometimes you're getting information from them. It's like, what are different sneaky type thiefy things you can do? You can steal stuff, you can steal information documents, you can overhear information, and I think that gave you another thing to be doing when you were sneaking around, is get as close as possible so you could hear them and overhear, often their dialogue had clues about where something was.
Shakespearean about the convenience of eavesdropping in Thief, right? In Shakespeare, somebody's always talking and somebody's always speaking in earshot of an important character, right?
Yes.
But I mean, what struck me playing it is that I don't know, it's very believable to me the way, and I don't know if it's just quality of writing or quality of acting, because there's a lot of games where the amazing thing for me about Thief 1, and I know that some people complain the AI is dumb, it's like, why would anybody do that? But for me, there was something about the way the characters were stupid that seemed very believable. You know what I mean? And in some ways, years later, I was thinking, why do I like this game so much? And there's something about Thief 1 that almost feels like a nerd revenge fantasy to me, because what's it about? It's about kind of this weak, smart, kind of witty character.
Yes, and the bear pit conversation sets all of that up as well, right? It's the very first conversation you eavesdrop on, and one of its purposes is just to sell what buffoons the guards are.
No, exactly, yeah.
And they're meant to be. I mean, when people say that the AI are stupid, well, it's a game about outsmarting the guards. What do you expect? I mean, if they outsmarted you, it wouldn't be very much of a game.
Well, and there's a certain I guess to me that brings up interesting topics about the interrelation of characterization, voice acting, writing, and game design, specifically in relation to AI design, right? Because the AI design and the voice acting and the writing and everything kind of mesh to create something that, to me at least, doesn't feel broken. It feels like it's expressing something coherent about a fictional world, and that's one of the really interesting things.
Well, and your question about the writing and acting and such, I think that's also, to some degree, that's tied into the gameplay structure as well. Structurally, the overheard conversations in Thief are a lot like the audio logs in System Shock or in Bioshock, right? You come across them, you listen to them. The big difference is you don't get to listen to them again, and you can interrupt them. Right, and the fact that you can interrupt them actually is one of the things that motivates the effort that we put into some aspects of it. I mean, if we want you to stop or slow down and take in these conversations, we need to motivate you to do that. And one of the ways that you do that is that you embed some of the conversations with useful hints about how you might approach your mission, but also you need to make them really entertaining, right? They need to pay off on their own terms if the player is going to sort of set aside their other activity and listen to them. And so that was one thing that we had very specific discussions
you
about.
You can't click through and read the subtitles of.
Right. And I remember talking about that very specifically during the development of Thief. Is like we really need to make these conversations worth listening to, you know.
And that was your job?
Often, yeah.
To make them, so they were like, well, we need to make these great, so make them great. So.
Try to make them entertaining and very short. And
so where does taffer come from? Was that your solution? We need to be entertaining, so like you try to give them some personality, or like where does that come from?
That comes sort of from an original evolution. A lot of the dialogue was, I think it was Greg LaPiccolo's theory was there should be sort of an argot, a thief's cant that. Everyone was speaking, and there would be words for all sorts of things. You wouldn't say here. There'd be something for that. There'd be eagle. I think was.
I think that was correct.
For I saw something, and so I read all these like long things. I eagled something, and then the playtesters was like, we don't understand what they're saying. This is no good. And when the NPCs are supposed to be conveying information to you about their state, it really can't be that unclear. And so then I went, I had to go through and take out all of these, made up words. But taffer was the only one that really stayed. And often I would use it kind of as a swear word. Who's the taffer who's
taffing around?
Yeah, who's taffing around there?
Yeah.
Who's the taffer who did that? Because they're guards. They're not very bright. They're probably going to be swearing. But we're trying to have a game that doesn't have swear words in it. So So that just became the placeholder for the swear word, and you can make it a verb, you can make it a noun, you can do all sorts of things. And
much like real swear words.
Yeah, exactly.
It
eventually I came up with a sort of a back construction for it, which is there's some Hammerites that are talking to each other later. One of the Hammerites says something taffer, and the other Hammerite is like, don't say that. That's derived from the trickster. And when you say his name, you give him power. Don't do that. I don't even know if that one made it into the game, but it was, in one of my spreadsheets somewhere.
So that's actually, so this is really fascinating to me. One of the reasons why I would play a game like that and sort of imagine a singular author behind it who had everything figured out is because that level of coherence between a small detail like that contributing to the overall world design of the game. Because what you're talking about is writing interesting dialogue, but you're also talking about fictional world flushing out, right? You're sort of deepening the fictional world, you're creating a mythology, and one of the things that really struck me about Thief is it creates a really interesting mythology very quickly, and without sitting you down and just telling it to you.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about like how that came, because I love that world, I love the characters, and there's that whole kind of nature versus technology theme, but and I know that like lots of things have that theme, but in that game it felt very, original to me. It's got like the steampunk, the kind of low fantasy medievalism, and I'm wondering like, where did that come from? Is it one person? Is it two people? Was it an accident? Was it sort of an accident?
Wow. It was not just one person, though. I would lay its origins, I think, probably at the feet of Ken Levine. If you look at that kind of retro tech kind of style, you see the same sort of thing in BioShock, right? It's not the same retro tech, but the original concept docs for Thief had a lot more focus on the use of elementals as power sources and these sort of background elements, no pun intended, having to do with the Hammerites and their role in the world. And the trickster kind of came as counterpoint to that in a pretty obvious way. And in some sense, we didn't want the player character to be sort of clearly on one side or the other of that. Garrett sort of works much better in sort of a more morally ambiguous kind of area.
So is that where Garrett comes from as a character, like his characteration? Like
his characterization is sort of a lot of it comes as sort of in the role of a chorus. I mean, he's there in large degree to sort of comment on the Hammerites and the trickster and their conflict and the futility of all of it. And in some sense, the way that I see it, like we kind of identified the Hammerites as a force of order and the trickster as a force of chaos, right, in opposition to each other. But they're both sort of forces of faith, and against that, Garrett is more sort of reason, right? And so there's this sort of triangle of ideologies going on there, so that things are a little bit more, I hope, kind of nuanced in the story of Thief.
Certainly seems to. I certainly agree.
But I think that kind of started all from the concept of the hammers as sort of the initial and primary enemy that came out of Ken's concept documents. At least that's my recollection of the sort of arc that we went through developing all of those elements.
That also kind of so who was, so I know you wrote sort of, it sounds like, what writing did you do other than the kind of the character dialogue, or is that the main thing you did, or?
Yeah, that's the main thing I did. I think I did work on the manual, and but it was mostly stuff people said. The
stuff people
which
said.
is a lot of what actually communicates the story in that game. And that was one of the things that we were trying to do specifically, was to have multiple channels of narrative going on, between the overheard conversations and the briefings and the lore objects that you could find in the missions. And I have a whole list of more minor ones off.
There's also
somewhere in
documents
my head,
too,
but-
right? You pick up and read at some point.
Yeah.
That's where I remember there was one where the trickster outlines his plan, which he calls the Dark Project, which the way I read that, you can tell me if I'm wrong, it was like, we called this project the Dark Project,
Yes.
the game, and then we just wanted to rationalize a way to use that
Absolutely.
in the game.
Yes.
That is entirely correct. And we didn't even necessarily...
It's because we couldn't come up with a better name for the game.
Yes, it was a
Yeah.
code name. It was, and it was from back when we were working on an entirely different concept pitch, which was Dark Camelot, where you're in the role of Mordred, who's secretly a freedom fighter against the evil Arthur, and all this stuff that never got made. All that was really retained from that was the idea of the player character as sort of this, less sort of black and white hero, more kind of a Robin Hood figure. And so, none of that happened. But the concept pitch name, Dark Camelot, when we threw out the concept, we still had to refer to our team as something, right? So it just became the Dark Project, because we didn't know we didn't know what we were going to do, but
You knew it was dark.
and we knew we weren't the Dark Camelot team anymore. So it was just the Dark Project. And that somehow made it into the press materials, and then we couldn't get rid of it.
I remember the
after
first
that.
trailer I saw, which is still on the game is the intro, but it doesn't say Thief, it just says the Dark Project.
Right, yes.
And
So Dark Project had to become the subtitle when we finally had a title.
And then it just had to be stuffed into
otherwise we
things
just would have
somewhere.
confused our whole sales channel. and then that the bit that you were talking about was like, let's get this Dark Project phrase into the game somehow.
It's an interesting constraint to think that we have to make a game. Well, what does it have to be? Well, it's got to be dark, right? And then that's
that stylistic decision actually it happened early on, and then but even before we settled on the concept of the thief.
It's interesting that darkness. It's funny. I mean, it sounds funny to say, but it is funny though. It is an interesting constraint because the gameplay is all about darkness.
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, it's about darkness as a useful gameplay instrument.
Oh yeah, darkness is your friend.
Which was another really interesting thing at the time. And I know that Sarah hasn't got a chance to talk yet, but I know that you were doing level design, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's you're having any thoughts about anything you want to contribute to the conversation.
I actually
came on.
I came on as a designer really after Laura actually who was already working on the project because I had seen almost most of the way we were. Were we in beta when I came on, or almost? I don't think we were quite in beta, but all of the levels had been built, and so what I actually was much like Laura. I was a jack of all trades, fill in the blanks designer. And I took a couple of levels that had been built by artists, but who weren't going to populate and script them. And I ended up populating them and scripting them and setting up the traps.
Thief 2, you were much more substantial roles.
So not designing the space itself.
I did not no really physical design other than this needs to be tweaked here. Here's some fixing small bugs.
What would you say your? I know that Tim and Laura just sort of you talked about things that you felt. You felt authorial about or had authorial connection to. Is there anything that comes to your mind? Like if you say like,
most of
that's me in the game.
Most of what I had authorial control over was the gameplay of the levels I worked on.
And which levels were those?
Oh, good heavens. There were...
Well, you don't have to list all of them.
Yeah, no, the problem is I'm trying to remember, much like Tim has forgotten it all, I've forgotten it all. There was the mansion level, when you break into Constantine's mansion, and that level had pretty much no gameplay in it whatsoever. It was a really beautiful space.
Kind of Escher-esque. Right?
Yeah, very Escher-esque, and there were like 2 traps set up, and then there was... There was this
visual concept.
It was a beautiful.
That was about all that.
It was a beautiful visual concept, but it wasn't really clear how it linked in with story, other than hey, you're breaking into this to advance your plot.
Yeah.
And then there was no gameplay set up in it whatsoever. And so I went from playing the game to okay, I've been dodging these things. Now can I set up interesting encounters? Yeah.
That is a crazy level.
It is a crazy level.
It is extremely crazy.
I remember thinking, oh, holy moly, this is the first level. That was the first level I started on, too. I actually did some work on some of the other levels as well. And in Thief 2, I did a fair bit of level design and cleanup as well. I forgot to mention that I was a designer on level 2 as well.
And you mentioned Thief Gold as well, too. And there's something in Thief Gold that, if I remember correctly, is an interesting variation on the whole... We want to have dialogue, we want to have somebody who's alive but who you can't interact with. I mean, I seem to have this vague memory of it. There's one level in Thief Gold where it's a level that's not in the regular Thief where you meet a drunk character who's like crazy and drunk or something. Do you remember that? It's like he's standing right in front of you, like he's not dead and he's not trying to kill you because he's not a guard, but he's just babbling incoherent.
Isn't there a drunk in the back alley of one of the... I would have put him in the back alley of the first mission or something.
Yeah,
but
I don't...
Oh, no, yeah. There is a drunk... But I think the one in Thief Gold I'm specifically thinking of is a little bit more expository deliberately, whereas I think that... But that's actually that is really interesting when you mention that, because the first level...
There is one in the Lord Bafford mission as well.
Yeah.
Well, because one of the things that's interesting about Thief 1 is, I think a lot of people forget, is that level kind of, and some of the levels kind of start in a space where people actually aren't trying to kill you, they're just like civilians, right? It's just like people on the street, and you're not actually doing any, it's not like Metal Gear or something where you're behind enemy lines, so anybody who sees you is going to try and shoot you. It's like, you actually have to break in somewhere before you're doing anything illegal. And there are drunks, and there are kind of some of these other people out on the street too. But there is a little bit of a subtle kind of going down the rabbit hole, I think, in the first level of Thief, where you can't start, and I even think there's
you break in through a well. In fact,
break in through a well,
and you have to, and that's where and at that very first interaction where you can decide whether you want to try and distract the guards by sending them off on a hunt, or if you want to try and
Also, when I had lunch with you, I was telling you about the level that I was going to work on, that I was working on for Thief 2 Gold, which was the Hammerite mission when everyone's a mechanist, and that had a drunk Hammerite in it, and so. I don't remember whether you actually remember playing and encountering this expository drunk or...
No. I do remember. I have a very vague memory of. I think there's one of the extra levels in Thief Gold has like an opera house in it.
Yeah.
And there's and you come up to the opera house like through the ground, and there's like a drunk guy like near the hole, but he's saying something sort of important. It feels more like
Terry might have written that, because that was her level, and she did some of the co-writing as well. This is Terry Brosius.
I mean, a lot of the levels had a lot of stuff that was written by the level designer. Either both the Garrett voiceovers as you were encountering things, or just dialogue.
That was very much like the designers. So you have a whole bunch of different people. How many designers would you say were like working on? Because I know I also remember the end credits where everybody's got the hood hood on, but I remember that I think that people are credited with the individual levels they worked on in the credits, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And I know that, like for example, I seem to remember Randy Smith being like the person responsible for like the really weird, messed up horror levels, primarily. I might be wrong, but
that sounds about right.
That's kind of my
about right.
memory, but.
Yeah, and
he was the Asylum in Thief 2.
I think so, but it was very much one level designer having primary responsibility for a particular level,
but also writing, right? So, it's not just I built a level, now you write something.
No, they were definitely in on the writing of their level as well.
Well, and that's, I guess, to me, that's kind of what's fascinating about this question, because I've played a lot of games where it's like, there was 100 writers, it's like, oh, you think? Because like it's just all over the place, but Thief doesn't feel all over the place to me. It feels very directed and very coherent, and I don't know if, was it just that like everybody at the office was just on a really similar wavelength? Like were you just like all eating the same food?
Well, part of it was, I think, that we had good communication about what the style was, like what those goals were.
Did you have like a Bible or something? Like was it written down, or was it just meetings, or was it more?
There was an element of that. I mean, there was more written documentation than ever made in the game. And this is sort of another interesting thing that I generally like think is a good thing in games. Is, you know, there's stuff that you write not for the purposes of putting in the game, but for the purpose of making sure that the stuff that does go in the game is all coherently related to one particular thing. And the corollary of that is like that you don't have to communicate your whole story by telling it to the player, right? You can leave gaps for them to fill in, and you know, with the knowledge that they might not all fill them in the same way as the other player did, but that's interesting, and more, it gives them something to talk about when they're on the discussion forums. I mean, you know, they can form certain conclusions about what these things mean to them in the interstices of the stuff that you did put in. So partly, I think it came out of that idea of having sort of a sort of consensus narrative built up fairly well within the team that was more specific than the stuff that went in the game. And if there were inconsistencies, they were more sort of in this higher level of detail that never actually made it in the game. So.
One thing that strikes me that's really interesting about that was when you say there's a lot of stuff that was made but didn't actually make it in. Mm-hmm. My first encounter with that was opening up the CD for Thief and looking at all the voice files, and there's like 10% of what's on the CD you actually hear in the game. There's like a huge amount of like incidental Garrett dialogue. Like there's like there's a guard down at the end of the
lots
hall,
of stuff
but if I use a water
that,
arrow, you know what I mean? But it's just like none of that's in the game, and at least I haven't found it. There's only very few moments where, and I'm just wondering, like, was that
sometimes it was playtesting? You know, that people would say. Some of the, you know, if Garrett is just saying something over and over as he's talking, then he starts to sound sort of like the guards who are just, you know, expostulating at a drop of a hat. Mostly Garrett is taciturn and occasionally snarky, and he shouldn't say stuff unless it's either really useful or funny or, you know, snide.
Well, and the way the audio production works too, it's so much harder to go back and do pickup sessions based on feedback that the incentive there is to err on the side of writing and recording a lot more stuff than you think you're going to use, right? Because you can always pull out as a result of your playtest feedback, but it's hard to put more audio in.
It is interesting because, lots of games have a voiceover, but abuse it, right? Or you hear it a lot, or it plays over and over again. And I think Garrett speaks like 4 or 5 times through the whole game, but you really remember each time because it's like exactly at the right moment that sort of creates a punctuating kind of character moment. And he always struck me as a really interesting character, and I'm wondering, like, who was involved in the voice casting for that? Because the guy who did his voice seemed like really, so like he had the writing, and then like did the same people involved in part of the writing process do the voice direction or casting, or like I'm just curious as to like how that.
No, the direction and casting was on the audiovisual team, which would have been like Dan Thron and his people, which was pretty much separate from the writing. He worked pretty closely with Terry when she was doing she did most of this is again Terry Brosius did the cutscene authorship. So they worked pretty closely together, but he didn't work very directly with the mission people. It would have been I think Dan Thron and Greg LaPiccolo on the first game who did the voice direction and casting.
Dan's also the voice of the stupidest guard.
Yes, Dan is a surprisingly good voice actor.
The guy, the Bear Pits guy.
Yeah, he gets named Benny, I think, in Thief 2 because he was so popular.
Yes.
Yeah, he's kind of like that's because is it the one guy who reappears all the time? Like even if you kill him, he's back, right?
Dan does several voices himself as well. Like in addition to like like Benny the guard being a recurring character, but Dan actually did several like guard characters and Hammerite characters, as I recall. And then Stephen Russell, who did the voice of Garrett, has like a very wide range vocally in terms of like pitch and dialect and accent and everything. Like he did a surprising number of those characters.
So he's like all over the place in the game, but you wouldn't know it.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
cool.
I saw Stephen Russell in a Huntington play the other last season. It was
yeah?
holy cow, that's Garrett. He didn't sound like Garrett at all. He had some.
Well, yeah, because
was he a stage guy primarily?
I don't remember what his other work was.
Because that's the other. I mean, it sounds like it would be interesting to get the people who are sort of more directly involved in the day-to-day with that at some point. But I'm just kind of interested in this topic because it's like so much of video game voice acting seems to come from the kind of like voice acting talent pool, which is like largely defined by like television animation, or at least comes from that kind of culture. And
sure.
and sometimes there was a I know that what's his name, Dennis Dyack told me a story once about wanting to cast what was it, the original Legacy of Kain, and he asked for actors from one of the main talent people. And she's like, oh, I got all these people who worked on like the Jetsons and who did all this kind of stuff. And he's like, well, okay, well, who else you got? She's like, oh, I got these theater people. And he's like, well, why don't you give me the theater people? Like we're making a kind of a serious adult game here and everything. So,
right.
So and I'm not saying that other voice acting is bad necessarily, but it just seems like there could be so much more, I don't know, places to draw from for video game voice acting that it seems like people don't go to a lot of the time.
Sure.
Well, there were a lot of programmer voices too. I mean, not for the really big voices, but
No, but we were still using.
The servants were.
Yeah. We did like an open casting call on the team to see who we could get there,
Which
you could not do nowadays.
What about this? But so this is also making me think of System Shock too. Isn't there a fair amount of
there was even more of it.
Like developer kind of voices
was,
in System Shock? It's like all over the place, right?
Oh, System Shock was entirely non-professional voices except for Terry, who did the voice of Shodan, and she was not primarily a voice actress. She was a singer. But at least she was professional.
She was, as a person, as a voice performer, she was a professional. She had professional experience doing that.
Yes.
That's what she did. Okay. Well, I remember. Yeah, I don't know. I remember that stuff quite a lot. I know. Sarah, you were talking about the faces before, right? You keep saying it's not your voice, but it's your.
No,
you're one of the faces in.
I'm Rebecca Lansing.
You're like the Ed Harris character in Apollo 13 in System Shock. You're like the person who helps you through the whole game.
That's my face. It's someone else's voice, as I said, but yeah,
right.
that's.
So your voice is in there.
My voice is in there, but I don't remember where.
You're the character. All I remember is that you're the character that my character is leaving voicemail for. And can't make it to dinner because their actress melting down or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was Charlotte or something.
Charlotte something. Yeah.
I just remember that I was Mark and I had to say, Char, this is Mark. Listen, I just can't make it to dinner tonight because. And you can go places from Track City and compare that what I just said.
The great thing about being voice actors is that now we're in IMDb for it, so we can connect ourselves to Kevin Bacon.
That's true.
Oh wow, that's cool.
I think that my biggest role in any of the Looking Glass games was actually in Flight Unlimited, where I'm the voice of all the airports.
Oh, I forgot that.
Oh, you are? There's airports? I just remember
the
constantly
FBOs.
crashing and then respawning.
If you manage to actually contact someone and say they want to land, and you hear someone give you your flight numbers and your runway numbers, that's me.
Okay. One of the things that interests me about the history of the Looking Glass games is the kind of non-first-person shooter evolution of the first-person immersive kind of narratively rich game, whatever you want to call it, and of course we do have stuff like BioShock Now, which is sort of an evolutionary offshoot, of course, of that. But I guess it's still kind of like, and to its credit and popularity, can easily be identified as an FPS, where it's kind of harder to identify what a lot of the Looking Glass games were. And for me, that's awesome because I like that kind of that kind of richness.
Yeah. Well, there's this whole argument about, and not that anyone's arguing it much these days, but when System Shock 1 was first out, there were people who would object to other people calling it an RPG, and they'd end up in this big discussion about like, is this an RPG? And if it had been top down and you'd been Link, for example, then it would have been an RPG.
Like almost the same design on paper.
The big issues were like that there was no character sheet, and that all the character progression arc in terms of abilities over the course of the campaign had to do with getting more inventory items and not more stats or skills or things on your character sheet the way it was in Underworld 1. And if you look at that model, that's exactly the ability progression model in like the Legend of Zelda games, right? Mm-hmm. Which no one argues about whether they're RPGs, right? But since we were in first person, like, I guess no one thought of that or something.
It was also early first person too, right? Where the conventions were kind of still solidifying, and what exactly does first person mean was still really kind of it hadn't really solidified yet.
Right,
it was really early.
And I think there was even fewer points of reference in those days. I mean, when Underworld 1 came out, it was a month or two after Wolfenstein 3D came out, right? And for the longest time, it was, us and really, really stripped down early id style run and gun type shooters, right? And if you look at even things that are squarely in the middle of the FPS market these days, there's a lot more to those game systems than was going on in Doom. At the very least, there's cover, for example. So just the idea that there's a little bit more breadth in your choices when it comes to the first person is not a genre, right? It's one element of your format, and that's all, right? And it doesn't necessarily determine all these other genre decisions that in the early days, like it kind of seemed like people thought that was the case because they only had a couple of examples to draw from in terms of what the game could be.
But even now it's kind of interesting, and the way that even in System Shock 2, for example, there's a little bit more of and I know that wasn't Looking Glass entirely, but you're kind of going down a more kind of conventional RPG path, right? With
much more so.
Like with the stats and everything like that. One of the things that is really interesting to me about the first System Shock is that kind of, I don't know what you would call them. I tend to, in conversation, call them discrete tool-based character advancement system, right? Because it's not, your improvements are not sort of like levels of effectiveness of items. It's more like, I have a thing and it does X.
Yes,
and I have it or I don't.
Much more qualitative than quantitative.
And it is very much like, it's interesting that you mentioned Zelda, because that's very much what it's like. It's like Zelda or
Metroid.
Or Metroid, which is actually why when the first Metroid Prime came out in 2002, I remember saying like, wow, to me that was like almost like a sequel to System Shock, because it was like this science fiction game where, you had these, it was tool-based, right? Because it was Metroid.
Right, because it was Metroid.
I do have kind of a strange question, which is maybe, this is like a fan question that I can't articulate in any other way. It's like, why is the lean so awesome in Thief? Because there are so many first-person games that have a lean. Like, it's a first-person game, I've got my blinders on, I'm playing in like an FPS with mouse look, and I go to do my lean, but the screen kind of goes, just kind of like, there's something about the way that the screen moves, and I don't know if nowadays they try to map leans to some kind of polygonal character that's actually there, like for body awareness or something, because
that may be,
and I don't know, and I'm just wondering, like
I mean, one thing is that because there wasn't a model, Garrett did not have a model. He had arms, right? And there was sort of this sort of very rough physics model for Garrett. He's a snowman. Just as secretly in System Shock, you were also a snowman, because at the time, your physics system could not handle the kind of skinning.
Are you saying he was literally a snowman?
Yes, you were a pair of spheres.
Oh, okay.
No, so in terms of what
I was thinking, like, you're saying, I thought you put an actual snowman on, like he had buttons and a nose.
No. No, though there is a placeholder model for
There's a box.
for Garrett in the game.
Okay.
You're a sort of brown Mr. Potato Head looking rectangular kind of box.
Oh, that's kind of awesome.
But
should be
but no, in terms of
an
your physics model, you're a
With an
snowman. And the one thing that results in though is that there was a lot of control there over the properties of that model, because it was all done in-house at Looking Glass by our physicists. So to the extent that came out well from a user interface point of view, I think the credit probably goes to just the degree of control that they had.
The chopping motion, like all the stabbing and chopping motions, the fact that Garrett was a box as opposed to a person actually made it very difficult.
Oh.
We originally motion captured all sorts of stabbing and chopping and slashings, but when you take just the arm part of that motion and try and play it, like if you're try and imagine stabbing someone or chopping someone, if the rest of your torso is bolted into a frame, you're not very you're very wussy.
And what your arm is doing doesn't make sense anymore out of context of what your shoulders were doing, right? So he has no shoulders.
Yeah, so we ended up ripping out all the motion captures there because that just wasn't working.
Though another thing about leaning in that game, it sort of gets back to this kind of this issue of the amount of iteration we were able to do in the development cycle there, and the degree to which some of the features were not planned ahead of time and were sort of like improvised during the process, and that's the listening at doors, which is only occasionally like really crucial, but is often really useful, and no other game that I know of ever does it. Which is if you lean sideways into a door, you can hear what's going on the other side better than if you weren't doing that. You can actually like press your ear against a door in Thief.
That's actually really interesting because
little known fact.
I would almost call that that's like an emergent verb in a sense, right? Because it's not like a verb that's so. It's like you just take an existing verb.
There's no listen at door action that you can do, right? Like it's leaning in such a way that it brings your upper snowman sphere
on the other side of the door, which blocks sound
into a door.
Yeah.
And this was like, it's not the sort of thing you would go out of your way to support. I have to be honest about that, right? But the fact that our sound propagation system in Thief was so good, because we did not want to deceive you about where things that you were hearing were. Right, and so there was a lot of work put into making the sound propagation quite naturalistic, right? So the sound would propagate properly, through doorways and not through, solid walls and stuff. But because of that, like we had all this data so that we could, attenuate sound when there was a closed door, so that wouldn't fool you. Like, okay, now that we're doing that, we could stop attenuating sound when you lean up against the door, like I said, I don't know how much that actually gets used, but it's just delightful that it was so easy to do and that we had this sort of inspiration to do it.
Well, I know that when you talk about these kind of, you realize these things are possible, you realize that it doesn't cost that much development-wise to actually, because it feels like you had put these pieces in place not for the purpose of doing this third thing. But
and if you'd proposed to do all that work for the purpose of listening at doors, you would have been insane.
Yeah, but you just realized there's like all these dots, all you gotta do is connect these two, and this whole idea makes sense. And
which is like the severed heads.
I'm wondering if there's anything else sort of jumps out to any of you that sort of feels like that. Any other examples in the whole process?
I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'd be thinking about Thief Gold or Thief 2 though, because that's the point where you have all this understanding about the system, right? And you can really sort of play with what it's capable of a lot more than we were able to on the first
Is there
one.
anything you can maybe a better way to say it would be like, is there anything that you feel like really wasn't planned from the beginning but changed like a really, because I know that Sarah's mentioned to me multiple times that certain things in Thief came together really late near the end of the process.
Yes.
And I don't know if those were are some of those just fortuitous things that happened or because I know that for the first game I know the what the game was changed a lot, and
Yes.
That it kind of like when was the moment when it kind of became the thing that people know that it is? Like what confluence of elements, I guess, would...
Ooh.
One of the things was, like, the initial AI was much more like a camera connected to the wheels, almost, for the NPCs. They would see you and they would behave. And as I guess, people playing it felt like it was sneaking, it became more clear that you actually had to have a more complicated AI where they had an internal state of how much they are aware of there being something out there and what they are doing based on that. You couldn't have this sort of simple AI that homes towards you until it doesn't see you anymore. And I feel like, and then there was this long period where the AI was being ripped out and replaced with a better AI. And that was that was a turning point that I was there for, as opposed to the ones before that.
Yes, well, and all of that also sort of represented a much narrower focus on stealth than we originally identified. I mean, it would be easy to sort of look at the game now and just, people often refer to it in terms of being, one of the early, like, modern style stealth games, right, where a few other things like Metal Gear Solid and Commandos and some other stealth games were coming out around that same time. But to start with, we had much broader points of reference. We were looking at the Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories, where Fafhrd is not exactly sneaky. He's this hulking northern barbarian type guy, and the thing that you draw from that is more sort of this pulp adventure kind of notion of a thief. And this is something that we've talked about a lot, where there's elements in Thief 1 that come from that, like the sort of Lost City stuff and the barracks and all this stuff that aren't playing as much into the stealth metaphor, and that in Thief 2, we got away from those and focused much more on just the stealth game. Because in Thief 1, we hadn't identified that yet at the start as to, this is a stealth game. We started with, this is a thief game, and we were looking at
different kinds of
quite a lot of points of reference about, what a thief could be, and Dungeons and Dragons was one of them, and the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, and the Batman comics in terms of except Batman in the role of Garrett, not a thief, but that was a lot of the stealth element there that came actually from that.
That's actually so. I know Sarah knows I've said this before, but I definitely have gone on record saying that Thief 2 is a great game, but I am personally one of the few people I know who actually really liked that kind of more eclectic definition of being a thief.
I like the variety. I certainly agree with that. On the other hand, I felt like in Thief 2 we had enough of an understanding of what our game system was capable of that we were able to that by exploring those possibilities we were able to still have a lot of variety, even though we were sort of narrowing our focus a little bit.
There's definitely I wouldn't say there's less variety in general in the second game.
Right.
I mean, there's you push in that narrower focus, you kind of push it farther and kind of deeper in that way under that one theme. A little bit more of the kind of Ocean's 11, kind of just it's a heist, kind of thing. And I remember in Thief 2, there's that amazing level where, of course, I always played on the hardest mode, but where you have to ghost, where you have to not knock anybody out.
Oh, right.
In the police station, which is insanely nail biting. And but I remember in the first game, kind of when I first played it, I was like, oh, cool, this is the level where I'm the guy who's just sneaking into a guy's house, and oh my god, this is the level where I'm Indiana Jones.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I remember just finding that really thrilling, and there was a real sense in the first game of what are they going to think of next?
Yes.
And there's that, and I don't know if you can tell me a little bit more about this, but there's this amazingly weird level at the very end. And one of my pet peeves of a lot of games is when you've played the first level, you've played the whole game.
Yeah, sort of seen everything it has to offer.
And I think that in Thief 1 for me was surprising pretty much up until the end. There was fresh ideas even in the second half of the game. And there's a level called Undercover where you dress up as a Hammerite and then you have to be in plain sight of other people. And I'm just wondering if you remember how that level came about, or was it just what if we have a level where you're in a disguise? Because that's something that the Hitman series like that didn't really get picked up in the stealth genre again until the Hitman series a few years later.
I don't remember that level specifically. I remember sort of the early development of the mission tree in general. That was one of our big goals, I in particular. And this sort of came out of this idea of having to explore what did it mean to be a thief, right? Because we didn't have a lot of prior points of reference in video games to work from. And so, I mentioned some other influences, but with regard to that specifically, one of the things that I remember at the time really thinking a lot about was, I don't know if anyone now remembers the game Thieves Guild by this like small press outfit called Game Lords. It was in the, I guess must have been around 1980 in one of the early waves of post D&D kind of games where they were very much in a D&D type world and everything, but everyone was a thief, right? And the problem with that is if you look at what D&D had been doing at the time in terms of their published adventures and everything, there was no thieving going on, right? You had a thief character class who did no thieving in first edition D&D, and so they kind of had this problem when they did that game of really having to flesh out that idea a lot. It's like, okay, if we want people to be able to play that role and to have some variety in our scenarios, what are we going to do? So they actually in their printed supplements in Thieves Guild, they organized things by like these categories of thieving activity that you would do, right? Like they had a chapter which was like pickpocket scenarios and armed robbery scenarios and burglary scenarios and tomb robbing and that actually, I went back to that at that time and based on not just that list, but we went and we started brainstorming like what are all the sort of thievy things that you could do, and I'm sure that the disguise scenario came out of that process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing about that's just and I know it's apples and oranges, right, as to kind of which kind of variety you prefer, and it's like I said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with Thief 2, but I guess I know a lot of fans who are kind of down on Thief 1. They're just kind of like, oh, but I hated the zombies, and I love them, but again, I write about zombies. Yeah, I don't know if there's any final. I feel like this whole thing has basically just been about, like I said, for me, the whole thing is kind of about searching for authorship and like where, like, it's easy for like a big kind of guy who's presented in the press as being like an author of a game, kind of talking at a high level about why these things happen, but when I play games and really remember what makes them feel special to me, it's these smaller moments, right? It's like, who thought of putting the severed head in the thing?
Right, which are not central planning. They're
yeah, exactly. But in really good games, they feel like it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think to the extent that you have like an auteur in a game, and I suspect that this is true of anything, like their imprint comes as much from the sort of the environment that they create within the team where everyone can contribute their best work, and they can focus that, right? But they're not going to be the one who actually like crafts each individual, essential element of the work, right?
But it seems like the press still wants to give them credit for it.
Well, yeah. Well, you need to give someone credit, right? And the right person is going to bring out a lot better work in everyone. Like, and God bless Warren. Like my early experiences with him were like completely essential to learning, everything that I did about how to do this stuff, right? But at the same time, there's very few like specific things that went into the game that like you can point to that and say, yeah, that was Warren's idea, right? Mm-hmm. But like Hitchcock isn't Hitchcock without his cameraman and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I mean, I think it's a very natural impulse from the point of view of a fan too, not just the media. I mean, okay, you're a crazy fan, perhaps you actually have everyone memorized, but I think the average person, you listen to music and you want to know who wrote the song. You don't necessarily want to learn all of the names of the violinists in the orchestra. You know what the composer's name maybe and the conductor's name. That's why the conductor gets so much credit for an orchestra, even though like the musicians are doing a lot of the work. It's good to have a name to fixate your warm fuzzies on. Mm-hmm. I think that's natural.
Oh no, it's totally natural, and I'm certainly not against it. I mean, yeah. I think it's fine. I guess it's just that it does make it harder to to talk about this stuff in a precise way sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not saying people shouldn't get credit for creating that environment, definitely, or I mean, it's fine if Ken Levine is like the guy who talks about BioShock or the new game they're doing. But yeah, I know it's just, I'm always fascinated, for example, on DVD documentaries when, Martin Scorsese's talking about, he's like, yeah, I mean, everybody talks about my editing, but my editor is doing that, right?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
And somehow, no matter how much you deny it, it just comes across as sort of endearingly humble. Like no one actually ever believes that you mean it.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, oh, what a great artist! He's giving other people credit. Isn't that wonderful? And it's like, I'm giving them credit because they did it and not me. Oh, isn't it great?
Cute.
I think that's really interesting because I mean, collaboration is great, but the coherence, the collaboration, and the pointed coherence, the fact that it feels so coherent and that it feels like there's a driver in the seat, I think is
but that person is less sort of like making all the decisions, or even sort of, it's not even like writing the Bible, though I mean certainly there are projects that have the Bible, right?
And it helped in the case of Thief, it sounds like.
That there was a lot of that.
There was a lot of documentation that you were saying was not used, or not directly in the game, but that was fleshing out the world for the writers.
But it's sort of its own skill set, right? Which is a lot. Your mention of a conductor in an orchestra, right? I think is an apt one, right? Because the sort of piece as a whole emerges from the coordination of all these elements, and that is its own skill. And the way that you go about coordinating them is going to color the final result in certain ways, right? I mean, I'm sure that were I, a trained classical music, connoisseur, right? Like that, I could tell the same piece conducted by one guy as opposed to another by his conducting style, right? And yet it's the same piece, and it's like it's being synthesized from all these individual musicians with their own style, but the sort of central intelligence of the piece is still sort of coming through.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's just, kind of continuing with that. It's something that we kind of run into at Gambit a lot. I just think about my last two summers, where the first summer, the problem with the team was, and it was a small team, right? It was like 8 people, but the problem with the team was there's no central vision. So then we spent this whole summer talking about, we have central vision, and the lesson I learned from this last summer is, if you get a team together with, it's like, there's no magic to it. It's like if you get a team together that has enough people who are mature enough to kind of do it, then they do it themselves. Like they police each other, and then you don't have to go to a vision holder. You can, they become each other's vision holders for the whole thing.
Well, and a huge part of that is people are always going to have certain disagreements, and one of the core values that the team has to share is valuing getting something done and resolving problems, right, as opposed to valuing particular decisions that are involved in that, right? And if you can, and that is a matter of maturity.